Cátedra Internacional de Opinión Pública, José Antonio Meyer Rodríguez. Conferencias magistrales. Paneles de análisis y discusión. Presentación de libros. Cátedra Internacional de Opinión Pública, José Antonio Meyer Rodríguez, presenta
Well, thanks everybody for joining us this morning. Let me introduce our speaker for today, which is Patrick Egan. Patrick is a professor of politics and public policy at NYU, New York University. His research focuses on Americans' political attitudes and behavior and their consequences for public policy, partisanship, and identity. He is also the inaugural director of NYU's Berkeley Institute for Civil Discourse and Civic Solutions, which is dedicated to promoting robust civil discourse across political divides to address one of the biggest challenges facing the nation and the world. Pat's political analysis and commentary are regularly featured in the news media, including at NBC News, where he has worked as an election night analyst for the exit poll desk since 2016. So Pat, I think with that resume, we are incredibly happy to have you share some of your insights, your knowledge about these midterm elections. I don't think I'm speaking out of turn by saying that perhaps these are not your very typical elections. So there's much to discuss, there's much to understand, and I think there's a lot of nuance that we will benefit from your study of elections, your experience with the analysis that you do regularly, and above all with your perspective, which I've always found enlightening, enriching. So I really think that the Cátedra Internacional de Opinión Pública will benefit much from it. So, without further ado, I'll let you start the talk, and then we'll go for a Q&A session afterwards.
Terrific, Marco and everybody. It's so nice to be here. I'm really honored to be asked to discuss American politics with an international audience. And one thing that I hope I will do is provide just enough detail and background so that I fill in the blanks if folks are unfamiliar with the intricacies of the U.S. political system, which can be very complicated. And I'm happy to clarify anything in the Q&A that I may leave out. I'm used to talking to U.S. audiences, and so I often presume a fair amount of background, but I'll do my best to make sure that I keep everybody informed. And yes, it's really great to be here, and I'm going to share my screen and get started here. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay. Good. Okay, great.
Yes, we can.
So again, I'm going to talk about two things. The first I'm going to dwell on quite a lot, which is the upcoming midterm elections in the United States. And then I'm going to riff a little bit on the future of American electoral politics, which of course is linked to present electoral politics, which we're about to hit in November. And just to give you a little sense of the talk, I'm going to talk about where things stand in terms of what we know about the two parties' electoral fortunes as they look in the fall. And that's very much indicates a pretty strong advantage for the Democratic Party, particularly in the U.S. House of Representatives. I'm going to address the gerrymandering issue, which of course has come to the fore over the last few months as both parties, and particularly the Republican Party, have made big moves to redistrict their House seats in the states that are under their control. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what's at stake in terms of governance, in terms of how things might work out in after the elections. And then I'll close the talk by talking about broader trends in U.S. electoral politics and what we might see going forward based upon what we're seeing now. And then I will very much look forward to your questions and our discussion. So where things stand in the House is that we have one of the closest margins of House control in recent history, with the Republicans holding just a 7-seat margin in the lower chamber, the U.S. House of Representatives, at 219 to 212, with a few vacancies. This is a map from actually a very great website called 270 to Win. 270 is based upon the number of electoral votes needed to win the U.S. presidency, but in fact, this website does a great public service and makes a lot of maps that are customizable and you can play with for both the House and the Senate, and of course the Electoral College. So this gives you a picture of current control with, as usual, the districts colored in blue held by Democratic members of the House, red held by Republican members of the House, and there's a few gray districts that are vacant right now. And this gives you kind of a big picture geography of how the U.S. looks politically right now, with Democrats holding seats on the coasts and in metro areas, and Republicans holding seats in rural areas and also dominating in kind of the large middle of the country. The seats you see in the American Southeast that are colored blue are largely those held by Black Democratic members of the House in districts that have been designed to maximize Black representation in the House of Representatives. And one of the things that is happening in this electoral cycle is that those districts are largely going away due to recent U.S. Supreme Court decisions that have made it possible for Republicans to remove those seats from play. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. In the Senate, the story is actually a little bit different, which is the Republicans currently hold an advantage of 53 seats to 47, and Democrats need 4 seats to win control there, which is going to turn out to be a much more uphill battle for the Democrats than in the House. This is what the Senate map looks like right now, again, from 270 to Win. The states that are colored solid blue are where both of the U.S. senators are Democrats. As a reminder, in the U.S., each of the 50 states gets 2 senators, and they are elected in staggered terms. So this year, about a third of the Senate seats will be up for election, and I'll talk about those seats shortly. But as you can see, one of the really striking things here is that in most states, both members of the Senate come from the same party, as indicated by the solid red and solid blue states. The states that are multicolored with the zigzags, and that's only, I'm counting them, it looks like 4, actually really only 2 if you're really counting it, and that's Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Those are the only 2 states that are represented by senators from opposing parties. Vermont and Maine are colored. I guess Maine would be the third. Maine is colored kind of odd because there's an independent senator who operates with the Democrats. So really, the way to think about this is of all 50 states, there's only 3 where senators either are members of or caucus with opposing parties. And that really tells you a lot about the state of American political polarization right now, which is that there's just not a lot of votes or senators or anybody in the middle. And this is one of those, this demonstrates that quite clearly. So as I said a minute ago, in the House, really all indicators right now are that Democrats will likely wrest control from the Republican Party, which we also call the GOP in the United States. GOP stands for Grand Old Party, and that's a moniker that the Republicans have held for quite a while. So in recent years, the party holding the White House, and of course that's the Republicans right now under Donald Trump, have lost House seats in midterm elections. And here's a picture of that over the last midterm and presidential elections since World War II in the United States. And basically what is graphed here is the change in House seats for the party holding the White House when the election happened. The bars in orange are midterm elections, and the bars in green are presidential elections. And what you can see, particularly in recent years, is that it is not uncommon for the party holding the White House to lose a lot of seats in midterm elections. And that's in part because we have this really kind of seesaw political atmosphere in the United States right now, where one party wins the White House. They often win control of both legislative chambers when they do. They enact a lot of legislation that moves policy in a heavily left or rightward direction. And the electorate responds by course correcting and electing a lot of seats, members to Congress of the opposing party. And so that's certainly what you've seen over the last 5 midterm elections. In all 5 of the midterm elections, the presidential party has lost seats in the House. And so that's just for starters. That's one reason why we would expect the Republican Party to lose seats in this year's midterm elections. Another thing is that the House vote is pretty well predicted by presidential approval, and Trump's presidential approval rating is quite low. And this is a graph that I actually just put together. I was really curious to see what the record was, again, looking at House elections since World War II in the United States. On the x-axis is the presidential approval rating of the incumbent president in each of those years in the fall of the election year. On the y-axis is the share of the House popular vote, aggregated across all 435 districts for the incumbent president's party. And what you see is really 2 strikingly different eras in U.S. House elections that have existed since World War II. Really, before 1994, the Democrats enjoyed almost complete control of the House of Representatives for nearly every cycle since World War II. And what you see there is that the House popular vote was actually not at all responsive to presidential approval before 1994. That's where the flat best fit line that you see on the left-hand panel in that graph indicates. There's just people were not casting their votes in the House in ways that were shaped by how they felt about the president's performance. That, of course, has dramatically shifted, as you can see in the right-hand panel here, which is all of the House elections since 1994. And there you see a strikingly strong relationship between presidential approval and how well the president's party does in House elections. And when the president is not doing well, neither does his party. And when the president is doing well, his party tends to do pretty well. What happened in 1994? Well, that is the year of what we call the Republican Revolution, spearheaded by Republican Newt Gingrich, who became Speaker of the House after the 1994 presidential elections, in which the GOP captured a huge number of seats, wrested control from the Democrats in the House, and proceeded to pursue a quite sharp agenda that opposed Democrat President Clinton. And really, I think in many ways, 1994 is a turning point for polarization in the United States, in part reflected in the Republicans' performance in House elections and how they proceeded to govern in the House going forward. So really, from there on out, as you can see here, you see a big connection between how the president is perceived by the public and how his party does in the House. And right now, that does not look very good for the Republicans. So most estimates of Trump's approval are around 38% right now. Again, we'll see what they look like in September or October. But it's hard to imagine his approval rating getting much higher than that. And if we were just doing a bare bones prediction of where that would lead things, it would mean that Republicans would get something like 47% of the House popular vote, which by all estimations, and even with the gerrymandering advantages that they've put together, which I'll talk about shortly, that's not enough for the Republicans to keep control of the House. So this is another strong indicator that the Democrats are likely to have a pretty good year. One more indication of that is when we look at how Democrats do in so-called special elections that happen that have happened since Trump took office at the beginning of 2025 and today. In the United States, special elections happen all of the time where there's a vacancy in some legislative seat, either in Congress or much more frequently in one of the state legislatures. All of our 50 states have the same kind of structure where there is both a lower and upper chamber of the state legislature, and those seats are often vacant for one reason or another, and we hold special elections to fill those seats. Those special elections, and comparing the performance of the two parties in these special elections against how the parties did in the most recent presidential election, give you a little bit of a sense of how the two parties are doing in between big national elections. And in this case, the record so far for the Democratic Party with regard to these special elections has been tremendous overperformance compared to Harris's result in the 2024 presidential election. And this is just a picture of what that looks like. What you see here are all of the special elections since January of 2025, Trump's inauguration. And in each of these cases, the elections are marked with abbreviations indicating the state in which these special elections took place. And thanks to, again, data gurus that are out there on the internet, you can actually just look at the extent to which each of these elections indicate Democratic over or underperformance compared to the 2024 result. And right now is what you see is a pretty steady story that Democrats are overperforming Harris's result by something like 13 percentage points, which is really huge. And that's been pretty consistent over this entire 18-month period since January of 2025. And so what does that mean with regard to past results? Well, it actually looks quite a lot like the blue wave in 2018, the last time Trump was in office, and the Democrats were opposing him in the midterm elections. And they, in fact, wrested control of the House in 2018. Back from the Republicans in 2018. And sure enough, the special election record in leading up to 2018 was very, very similar. If anything, the Democrats were performing a little bit less strongly in 2018 than they have so far in this particular cycle, with a mean overperformance of 12 percentage points back in that cycle. And just to show you that this is not just a Democratic thing, the last time the Republicans wrested control of the House during a Democratic presidency was in the 2022 midterm elections. And that was a year where Republicans were also overperforming in special elections that took place between 2021 and November of 2022. So again, the special election record is a good, if imperfect, harbinger of how the two parties are going to do in the midterm elections. But this is one where, once again, the Democrats are looking particularly strong, and signs point to a Democratic strong performance this fall. So you might be asking, what about gerrymandering? Gerrymandering is a wonderful political term that we've come up with in the United States that I think we've exported around the world as other polities, unfortunately, have adopted this practice. Gerrymandering is the drawing of political districts in ways that advantage your party at the expense of the other party. And typically, gerrymandered districts have the characteristic of looking like geography that makes absolutely no sense from a representation standpoint, but makes all kinds of sense in terms of maximizing the number of seats that your party is going to gain from an electoral map. So, there's always been an imperfect relationship between the share of the House popular vote and the share of House seats garnered by the two parties. And so that's what gerrymandering does, is that it tends to distort that relationship. And in fact, for much of the post-war era, this distortion really heavily favored the Democrats. It's also, to be clear, that in recent years, the gap has become much smaller. And so this is a nice picture using data from the Brookings Institution that compares the House two-party House popular vote for the Republican Party, that's what's on the y-axis, against the share of of House seats won by the Republican Party in the same year. And so the gap between those two percentages is a rough estimate of the extent to which the map either favors the Democrats, and those are the years where the shading is in blue, or the Republicans, the years where the shading is in red. And so, first of all, you can again see the two eras in sharp relief here, where in 1994, what had long been a big Democratic advantage in the House tips to a world where things become much more competitive after 1994. And also, it's the case that what had been a consistent Democratic gap now is something that shifts back and forth during elections and is, on the whole, much narrower than what had been the case before the Republican Revolution in 1994. And so that's just sort of to note that gerrymandering and the distortion of House seats from the House popular vote is nothing new, certainly something we've seen a lot in American history, and one that we would expect to continue to be the case. Now, the story has changed over the last 2 years because U.S. election rules now really give states nearly complete jurisdiction over how boundaries for their House districts are drawn. And this has become even more the case with a series of U.S. Supreme Court cases, one of which basically said, we're going to take ourselves out of having any jurisdiction over partisan gerrymandering. We're going to say, states, you do whatever you want. And the other thing is they've basically overturned Voting Rights Act rules that required many states to ensure the representation of Black and Latino political minorities by Black and Latino House representatives. The Supreme Court recently said that states do not have to do that anymore. And what that has meant in practice is that Republican-controlled states can get rid of these districts that were drawn to maximize minority representation and increase their numbers as a result. So what's happened in both red and blue states, among states controlled by Republicans and Democrats, is that both states are just maximizing their party's seats. And so just to give you some of the pictures, I think it's important to see these pictures because they're pretty dramatic. Here are two Republican-controlled states, Texas and Florida. These are both states where Republicans control the entire districting process. And in each of these states, the current congressional districts that will elect representatives this fall are colored on the basis of their relative strength of the two parties. Of course, red for Republican strength, blue for Democratic strength. And here you can see in both cases, the Republican Party has basically packed Democratic voters into very, very small dense urban districts where they are projected to win those seats by overwhelming majorities, and as a result have efficiently spread out Republican votes throughout the rest of states to maximize the number of seats that they are likely to win in those states this fall. Between these two states alone, Republicans have probably gained something like 9 seats in the House just by redistricting alone, and this is a big source of their gerrymandering strength this fall. Now, not to be outdone, the Democratic-controlled states have done similar things. And here the Democrats have a little bit of a harder time because while they tend to be particularly strong in urban areas, and that means to spread out Democratic votes efficiently, you basically have to make slices through big cities and then join them with more rural areas to efficiently distribute Democratic votes. And in fact, that's what you can see is certainly the case in Illinois. In the northeast corner of Illinois is the Chicago metro area where Democrats do quite well. But to spread out those Democratic votes, you have to draw these sort of spaghetti string-like districts out into the suburbs and further. And these districts, on their face make absolutely no sense from the basis of geography. In Virginia, Democrats tried to do the same thing. They are quite strong in Northern Virginia, in the District of Columbia suburbs. And again, you can see the districts that they proposed to draw that, again, extend way, way out from beyond the Democratic strongholds. That was actually struck down by the Virginia Supreme Court. And so these districts will not be on the map for 2026. But you can bet that in the future, Democrats in Virginia will try to do the same thing. So where does that leave things? Well, right now, the Republicans have a districting advantage that most experts estimate is worth between 2 and 4 percentage points in the House popular vote. While that is substantial and nothing to sneeze at, it probably won't be enough for them to win control of the House. And that's because in addition to all of the other stuff I've shown you already, that indicate a much stronger victory in the House popular vote than 4 percentage points for the Democrats. Current polling indicates that the Democrats enjoy something like a 6 percentage point advantage in the House. And that would be more than enough for them to win the 4 districts that they need to flip in order to win the House. So while this gerrymandering skirmish has certainly benefited the Republican Party, it is probably, at least at this point, not enough to help them win control of the House of Representatives. How about the Senate? Well, the Senate is harder to predict. So in order for the Democrats to win control of the Senate, they need to win 51 seats. And that's because if it's a tie, a 50-50 party tie, Republican Vice President J.D. Vance then gets to cast the deciding tie-breaking vote. That's a constitutional rule. And so that effectively gives Republicans control of the Senate in the event of a 50-50 tie. And so flipping 4 Senate seats is going to be a much harder task for the Democrats than their chances of taking over the House. And that's in part because most of the competitive Senate races, those places where Democrats have a chance of winning, are in states that Trump won just 2 years ago. And so again, here is another nice map from the 270 to Win website, where this reflects expert consensus on the states where Democrats and Republicans are doing well in advance of the this year's Senate elections. The states colored in light blue are those where Democrats are thought to be leaning ahead. Those in pink are those places where Republicans are thought to be leaning ahead. And the solid blue and solid red are those states that are not competitive this fall. The gray states are where there are no elections happening at all. And again, that just to remind you that in many states, there will be no Senate election because of the staggered terms that have been set up by the U.S. Constitution. So the key thing here is that the Democrats need to win 4 states or flip 4 states, and they are certainly not ahead in 4 states that they need to flip in order to win control of the Senate. What you see here are a number of states that the Democrats hope to flip. Ohio and Maine are probably the 2 chief states that they hope to flip, in addition to North Carolina, where they're actually pretty well ahead. And then in Michigan is also going to be a competitive Senate race. All of those states were won by Trump 2 years ago, except for Maine. And so it's just a much more murky picture for the Democrats here than in the House. And they start well behind the 8 ball in terms of any kind of advantage here with regard to the Senate. Okay, I want to talk briefly about what's at stake with regard to governance. And this is a larger conversation that I'm happy to flesh out more when we talk in the Q&A. But I think it's helpful to think about how the U.S. constitutional system works and what that means with regard to a Democratic House victory and the potential of a Democratic Senate victory. So if the Democrats win the House, I think there's two big implications for governance. The first is that basically they can block virtually all Republican legislation from being enacted. The Republicans have generally enacted legislation, Trump's legislation, on very narrow party line votes in the House and the Senate. And if the Democrats win back the House, that's effectively done. So we can expect the Democrats to block all but any bipartisan efforts to enact legislation. And that means that all of the most ambitious legislation that the Republicans might hope to accomplish will not happen if the Democrats take over the House. The other thing is that the House has quite strong investigative powers by dint of the U.S. Constitution, and that includes subpoena power, the ability to call forward any witnesses to testify in the House about a wide range of things, particularly government operations. And so what we can expect to happen if the Democrats take over the House is immediately a series of investigations into the Trump administration about a number of different activities that the Trump administration has undertaken that the Democrats have strongly opposed. And I think first and foremost will be investigations into corruption by the Trump administration, and also very likely immigration and immigration enforcement here in the U.S., which has been sharply politically polarizing and has been troubling to a lot of Democrats and, in fact, Republicans as well. If the Democrats win the Senate, the two things that happen there, in addition to that they gain in addition to winning the House, is that they can slow down or even completely block Trump's efforts to appoint conservative judges to the federal bench. And that's a big, big thing. So here in the U.S., all federal judges are appointed for life. Those appointments require the nomination of the president and then majority approval by the Senate in order for those judges to be appointed. Trump and the Republican-controlled Senate have been very, very efficient at appointing Republican judges to the district courts, the appeals courts, and they will continue to do so if the Republicans maintain control of the Senate. And that can be the case even if they maintain control by a 50-50 margin. In addition, if the Democrats take over the Senate, they can make it very difficult for Trump's nominees for cabinet and other executive branch positions to be approved. Now, in practice, what will happen is that it's likely that the Trump administration will just appoint a series of acting cabinet secretaries and other positions. That's certainly what they've been doing so far. But again, I think you would see a fair amount of blockage of executive branch activities should the Democrats control the Senate. One thing to be clear is that if the Democrats, even if they win both chambers, that gives them almost zero control over the ability to enact legislation. And that's because by the U.S. Constitution, the president can veto legislation, and that veto can only be overridden by a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate. And it is entirely unlikely that the Democrats, or either party for that matter, will enjoy 2/3 of the control of either chamber after the midterm elections. And so the biggest prediction is that we'll continue to have stalemate should the Democrats take over either chamber. I should also note that if the Democrats win either chamber, there becomes this high likelihood of standoffs between a Republican White House that has really flouted a lot of constitutional norms and has governed nearly exclusively through unilateral action. So far, the Republican-controlled Congress over the last 2 years has pretty much shrugged its shoulders at most of this stuff, with a few exceptions, and has abandoned what has long been considered an oversight role for the legislative branch in the U.S. constitutional system. And the Democratic minority in both chambers has, sort of railed against this, but largely without any power to do anything. If the Democrats take over either chamber, they will absolutely operate differently, and constitutional conflict will probably arise in that what is likely to happen is that Democrats will try to block executive action. The White House will continue to operate quite unilaterally, and a lot of this will continue to end up in the courts to determine the extent to which the White House can ignore instructions from Congress in how it operates. And I think that is, to the extent that we're already in a constitutional crisis, that will be exacerbated should the Democrats take over either chamber of Congress. Okay. So that's the midterms. Let me talk a little bit more briefly about what I see as the future of American electoral politics. And what I want to start with is that the key dimensions of American politics right now are race and education. That is, white voters have become deeply divided on the basis of educational attainment, and non-white voters remain in the Democratic camp, but are drifting to the right. And so we see this with data from the national exit polls from presidential elections going back to 1992. That was President Bill Clinton's first election. In green are non-white voters, and this on the y-axis is the share of each of these groups' vote that went for the Democratic presidential candidate in those years. And as you can see, among both college and non-college non-white voters, the Democrats have maintained a steady advantage, but one that has waned over the last, I would say, 4 presidential election cycles since Barack Obama's second election in 2012. What you see among white voters is a really dramatic shift and polarization on the basis of education, where, if anything, white college-educated voters have moved toward the Democrats over the last few cycles, and that's been particularly the case whenever Trump has been on the ballot, whereas white non-college voters have moved against the Democrats, again, in response to Trump's presence on the ballot. So this story is a really, really big one, and we see this reflected in the fact of American electoral geography. So white, less educated places have shifted sharply to the Republicans. High education places, and particularly metro areas, have moved to the Democrats, and places that have become more racially diverse have become more Democratic. So we typically see a map like this when we think about U.S. presidential or election geography, the blue states and the red states. And while that, of course, is important for things like the Electoral College, it's important to realize that what undergirds this is a map that looked much more like this. This is presidential vote in the 2024 election at the county level, where each of the bubbles is sized according to the number of votes that either party had as an advantage over the other in each of these counties. And here what you see is really that we've got the Democrats doing quite well in metro areas and even in red states like Texas and Florida. And the Republicans doing very well in rural areas, even in red states like New York and California, right? So what seems like a blue state, red state divide is really an urban-rural divide with some shifts that are also the case in rural areas where there are a lot of Black or Latino voters. That's the other exception to the rule. So keep this map in mind and not the previous one when you're thinking about U.S. electoral geography. Also, this map is a striking map. This is the extent to which counties have drifted toward the Democrats in blue or to the Republicans in red since the 2000 presidential election. That, of course, was the Al Gore, George W. Bush presidential election, and it was decided by a popular vote margin that was about the same as the popular vote margin in 2024, just slightly flipped. And so that turns out to be a good anchor point to look at change in American electoral geography over this period. And sure enough, what you see is that in the Appalachian region, stretching from Northeast Texas to Pennsylvania, the Republicans have made huge gains among these less educated, white voters in those regions. And the Democrats, by contrast, have started to do well in metro areas, even in the Southeast, where we tend to think of it as pretty strong Republican dominance. So again, undergirding the blue state, red state story is really a story that's much more about this, which is a much more complicated and I think interesting story with regard to American electoral geography. So really, the future of American electoral politics depends on whether these trends persist. On one hand, the share of college-educated voters continues to grow, and that's going to help Democrats to the extent that they maintain their advantage among these voters. The share of non-white voters is also growing in the U.S., and that helps Democrats too, although this advantage is shrinking, as we've seen over the last few electoral cycles. One difficulty for the Democrats is that there is a growing disaffection with the party among Americans. And so if we look at party identification in another set of data from the Cooperative Election Study, which has been in the field every election since 2006, you can see that the Republicans have caught up to the Democrats in terms of party affiliation over the last 15 years. And that the share of Americans identifying as independent has grown over this time from around 10% to nearly 20%. That is particularly the case among the youngest voters, where the Democrats have long enjoyed an advantage among young voters. But what's happening among those young voters is that they are increasingly identifying as independents. So this is party ID among Americans 25 and under over that same period. And here you see both parties, but particularly the Democrats, losing favor with younger voters, although they maintain a strong advantage over the Republican Party. But what's really happening here that's most striking is the growth of independent affiliation among younger voters over the same period. And that's come mostly at the expense of Democrats. And I think that bodes poorly for the Democrats' fortunes if this continues to take place over the next electoral cycles. So I'm going to stop there and happy to answer questions and flesh out more of what I've said here. But I hope it's been helpful and interesting, and eager to hear what you think.
Perfect. Thanks, Pat. I think we have we're still collecting some of the questions that we had, but let me maybe engage this a little bit more in a conversation, trying to get your takes on some interesting things, right? The typical case, you and I are political scientists. The typical standard model for midterm elections has been based on presidential approval and perceptions about the state of the economy, right? Would you still think that those are driving forces right now, or are they is the power of those two variables as explanatory of the outcome of the election, are they getting diluted by maybe other things like other specific issues that you discussed a little bit, or all of these structural factors with I believe you call it the gerrymandering skirmish, and so on and so forth. So, is it still relevant to think of presidential approval and the economy, or should we be thinking about other things?
Yeah, that's great question. I think the economy may matter less than it has in the past, in part because, and as you know, Marco, so many people view the economy through a partisan lens, right? So when there's a Republican president, you see Republicans saying that the economy is doing great, and then when a Democrat is elected, immediately that shifts, and vice versa. Nevertheless, I do think that presidential approval remains a really strong predictor of how people are thinking about how they're voting in the House, and perhaps even more to the case, how they're thinking about whether to show up to vote at all, right? So one thing that we're seeing, and this is the case in these special elections, is that basically Democrats are turning out because they're so frustrated, angry, enraged about the performance of President Trump. And also, I think a lot of Republican voters are kind of deflated by some of the aspects of the Trump administration, particularly the economy. And so I think these things still matter. I think there are probably fewer voters than before who are truly up for grabs in any particular election, whether it's a presidential election or a House election. But what we've seen over the last few cycles is that these fundamentals are still important movers of electoral fortunes in midterm elections. And my sense is that that will be the case this year as well.
All right. Thanks. Thanks, but I think that was super illustrative. So let me touch on one last point that you made, because I think it might be helpful for the broader audience, and especially because the independent phenomenon, like the independent growth phenomenon, is happening in different spaces, right? So so you look at the news at any given time, and it's this picture of polarization, right? I mean, it's sort of like almost ironclad coalitions that don't talk to each other and that actually, get confronted. But at the same time, we're seeing this middle ground that, people are not identifying with them. And they actually might be leaning one way or another. So how should we think about electoral elasticity, if you will, for these independents in this context of really strong polarization in the country?
Great. Yeah, I love that question. So I think there's a couple of ways to think about this. So one is that Americans as a whole, and particularly younger Americans, are disaffected with all kinds of institutions. Political parties is at the top of the list, but that's also true for media. It's true for anything government. It's true for religious institutions. It's increasingly true for even science, I'm sorry to say. And so this is a disaffected group, and it's particularly the case for young people. And a lot of these young people, as I showed you in that final graph, are people who perhaps in other years we would have thought would be affiliated with the Democratic Party. A lot of these young people are young voters of color, who Democrats have traditionally done quite well with, and they are finding the Democratic Party to be not attractive to them for a variety of reasons. The big question, and I don't think we really know the answer to this, Marco, is the extent to which those voters can be pulled in by the Republican Party, particularly a Republican Party that I'd say has not done very well at translating the gains it made among voters of color in 2024. Since then, they have done very little to continue to build that coalition, and a lot of their policies arguably are against the interests of voters in that coalition. And so I think the Democrats have a problem of mobilizing these voters, and a lot of those folks will certainly not show up to vote in the midterm elections. The big question going forward is, will they vote even in presidential elections, depending on who's on the ballot?
Okay. No, that's a great question. Thanks. And I think we have a question. Ricardo de la Peña was asking a question, but I don't know, Renee, if you want to go first, and then we ask Ricardo's question.
Sure, more than happy to go next. Thank you for this very interesting presentation, Pat. One theme I found particularly interesting was your discussion of which traditional predictors and patterns continue to hold and which may be changing in today's political environment. That got me thinking about the measurement side of the equation, in particular election polls. Survey response rates have declined substantially over time, as we all know, yet many of our most important indicators, including presidential approval, come from surveys. So in your opinion, your view, to what extent do you see that as an issue for what we're trying to understand here from the electorate? To what extent do you worry that changes in who responds to surveys could affect how we interpret trends in public opinion and their relation to election outcomes?
Yeah, it's a great question. So my sense is that we're in much more difficulty with regard to election surveys, like who are you going to vote for? Because, as you know, those surveys have to do two things. They not only have to measure attitudes and vote intention, but they also have to model turnout. And so those two things are very hard to get right, particularly in our current environment where a lot of Republican affiliated voters are really reluctant to respond to surveys. And so what can happen, and has certainly happened in the last few election cycles, in presidential election cycles, I should be clear, is that these polls have underestimated support for Trump and the Republicans in 2016, 2020, and 2024, despite all kinds of efforts to make corrections for that. Now, I should say that that has not been true in midterm elections. And that's in part because midterm elections, voter turnout is heavily weighted toward people who are particularly engaged and interested in politics, and people who are habitual voters, who tend to be people who are more highly educated, and that's a Democratic base more and more going forward. So the factors here, and then I think I also like the fact that we've got this record on the ground, which are the special elections, that kind of add to, those are real numbers, right, that tell us about the relative mobilization and enthusiasm among the two parties. And that's one where we're just seeing Democrats, succeeding like gangbusters. So I would be much less assured about these things in a presidential election cycle for the reasons you've indicated, Renee. In midterm elections, I think I have a little bit more confidence that what we're seeing here is evidence of a strong Democratic year.
Perfect. So, Pat, Ricardo had this question that I think is super relevant. So his question is, what is the risk that polarization, and I would add to that, the underspoken claims of potential fraud would lead to violence during this midterm election?
Yeah, that's a very important question, and one to be taken quite seriously. I would say, and the kinds of things that we're seeing around polarization in the United States are disturbing, and I think that's true whether you're a conservative or a progressive. Nobody wants violence associated with politics or elections, and this particular presidency has been unprecedented in recent years in the number of assassination attempts on the U.S. president. Pretty striking. There's also been a number of different assassination attempts, and unfortunately successful assassinations of politicians across the country at the state level, congressional level, et cetera. So these are all things to be taken very, very seriously. What I think is quite remarkable has been the lack of election-related violence at the polls themselves. And that was true in 2024. It's been true in special elections since then. And I take that as a relatively reassuring sign that will continue to be the case in 2026. Again, I don't want to underplay or discount that concern, because it is a very, very worrisome concern. But I take some comfort in the fact that we've run a bunch of highly polarized elections, really, let's say since 2016, where at the polls themselves, there's been a remarkable and welcome lack of violence in that regard. And also, I should say, in campaigns themselves. So I hope that will continue to be the case. I also hope that our politicians will tone down the rhetoric that might inspire such violence. And I wish I could guarantee that this is not a concern, but I take some comfort in the fact that the record so far has been somewhat reassuring.
Great. Let me turn to maybe one, or maybe two final questions. But so if you turn the TV over the last, on and watch news, or read news or something over the last maybe 6 months, Mamdani winning the mayoralty of New York City, and the ultra progressive left, if you will, moving forward, was a big issue. Now, with all of these primary candidates endorsed by Mamdani just winning consistently, and sort of like candidates that were going against established Democratic, more centrist candidates, I sort of like get flashbacks of what happened to the Republican Party with the Tea Party movement. So are we just now seeing the initial moments of a Tea Party moment for the Democrats?
We could be, and I think the parallel is a really helpful one to think about. And certainly, we've seen similar, quite progressive candidates prevail in Democratic primaries in, say, Philadelphia for a congressional seat in downtown Philly or West Philly that happened last month. Chicago is another place where quite progressive Democrats have done really well in primaries. Even in Los Angeles, the Democratic mayor faces an insurgent challenge from her left that was unexpected. And so I think that is the case in a lot of places. I think the place where the parallel breaks down, Marco, is that certainly demographically, and I would also argue politically, the Democrats are a much more heterogeneous party than the Republicans. And so what that means is that in order for them to win, they actually need to project a much more heterogeneous political menu, if you will,
Right.
in order to succeed. So you think about how somebody like Abigail Spanberger in Virginia or Mikey Sherrill in New Jersey prevailed huge, big victories in these blue states with relatively moderate platforms. Or somebody like Josh Shapiro, governor of Pennsylvania, probably the most popular purple state governor in the country right now, and he's got a very moderate agenda. So in order to win, the Democrats need to kind of offer sort of platforms that are tailored to the districts and constituencies that they're trying to win. And I think that's something that is much more complicated for the Democratic Party than the Republican Party, which has a homogeneous demographic base and often a political base, one that has been largely united under the Trump umbrella. And so I guess I would be surprised to see this moving beyond the deep blue districts in America's most liberal cities to places that Democrats also tend to do well. Now, who knows if that'll be the case? Well, but it's something to certainly pay attention to for sure.
Perfect. And I think, given the time constraints, and I don't want to take up a lot of your time, but I think given that you have so many pollsters in the audience, I'm going to ask you one particular question, maybe from the lens of where you stand every election night, receiving all of these results. Like for the last 10 years, the U.S. has not seen a single source, if you will, of ground truth in terms of exit poll data. Finally, again, in this election cycle, the voter poll by SSRS is going to provide that single source of truth. What do you think we're gaining, or what do we think we're losing by having this just one ground truth? And in the context probably of everything else that you've mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's both gains and losses. The gain is obviously that everybody's telling a consistent story, and so you don't have Fox News relying on one set of numbers and NBC relying on another. That's, there's a lot that's not very good about that. Although I should also say that in the last cycle, those numbers were not very far apart. So that's reassuring. I guess, as a researcher, as a political scientist, I always think more data, the better, right? And that the more we can triangulate among different kinds of sources, the more we're likely to learn about their various strengths and weaknesses, and therefore reach better insights as a result. So you guys know better than me that the polling and survey research is just completely overturned by everything that's happening right now on all angles. And what I'm really hoping for, and I know you all agree, is that this ends up being a good, high quality effort and one that all of us who work in the media on election night are using in a smart, articulate way to help voters understand what's actually happening.
Perfect. Thank you. And then to that end, let me just make a very quick commercial that here from René. NORC, in addition to the voter poll, is going to have the Civics, Health, and Elections Project as a huge effort to understand why all of these behaviors are happening throughout. So I don't know, René, if you want to add anything more about that, but or other questions. We're at the 10 a.m. mark in Mexico City and noon in New York time. So I don't want to take up too much, but René.
Yeah, thanks for the mention, Marco. Yes, I think there is interesting from a lot of journalists, researchers, and academia, and so forth to understand what math motivated voters to vote the way they'll do. So this most recent project from NORC is precisely designed to help answer some of those questions. Information will be available for free, essentially, and it's a non-partisan effort to better understand the electorate. So thanks for the mention, Marco.
Of course. Well, I don't think we have any more questions going around here. So I think, Pat, as always, it is a pleasure to talk politics with you.
Always.
To start with, and we really appreciate you taking the time to share all of this very detailed knowledge and put so many things in context that I think will be super beneficial for our audience that is right now watching your talk, but also for people that will later come around and watch a recording. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it, and I guess we'll see each other in New York pretty soon.
Yeah, I hope so. Yes, a real honor and pleasure to do this. Thanks for having me, and wishing you all a great afternoon. Take good care.
You too. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.